Aloha and welcome to Ku Punahou, that is New Kupuna, a wordplay on Ka Punahou. I'm Chris Yano, your host, and this is a talk story podcast by, for, and about us, the Punahou class of '69. It's a privilege to reach this age and realize, hey, we are the kupuna now. What kinds of responsibilities do we take on in this position, and what kind of legacy might we, as Ku Punahou, offer? Our guest today is Jaimee Wriston Colbert, professor of English and creative writing at SUNY Binghamton. She's the author of numerous award-winning books, including her latest, How Not to Drown. Welcome, Jaimee.
Thank you.
And I wonder if you could give us some sense. I mean, here we are in Hawaii, 6,000, 5,000 miles away from where you are. So tell us something about where you are, just so we can picture Jaimee in Binghamton, I guess.
In Binghamton, New York, yes. And today is an extremely cold day with a high of 12 degrees.
Oh, my gosh.
There is snow outside. We went from a unnaturally warm December into just, the cruelest that winter has to offer in January.
Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. I can picture that. I mean, I lived in Vermont and in Maine, so I know what those days are like, except I think this winter is quite extreme. All right. And if you can take us back over 55 years ago to your life in Hawaii, and maybe in particular Punahou, how do you connect then and now? I mean, so what are some of the elements of your days in Hawaii at Punahou that might show up in your life or your books today?
Well, my books, most of them, in fact, I would say all of them have references to Hawaii, and some of them take place in Hawaii. And I think probably, when I left for college on the West Coast, I told my parents I would never go further than the West Coast. But life has its surprises, and one of those was a husband, and another, eventually was my own career, which I had worked toward and always really wanted, which combines teaching and writing. So Hawaii is never, ever far from my mind. I go home every summer. I still have family there. And I still consider it my home, even though I'm very comfortable where I'm living, except for today at 12 degrees. But, it's I guess you can make a life anywhere, but it is always something for me that there's always something missing. And that is Hawaii. And, thankfully, I have my memories.
Right. And can you tell me something about maybe some of those kind of core memories of Hawaii? What do you hold in you of Hawaii?
Oh, my goodness. Well, as soon as you said that, of course, I was picturing myself on the beach. My friends and I from Punahou used to go to Sunset Beach quite a bit, and my parents for a little while had a little cottage on Kawela Bay. And I do miss that. I do miss the freedom of being able to, just go to the beach and lie in the sun and swim in the water and just, all of that sort of warmth that Hawaii has. Right. And the people. I miss the people. I have found for the most part people are friendly everywhere, but there is more of a reserve in the East Coast than there is in Hawaii. And when I come back to Hawaii, it still feels like home, even though so much has changed that my memories sometimes don't match, what it is now, especially Oahu, of course.
Yeah, I know that feeling. And sometimes it's strange to go back to some place that you think should be home, but some things are so different, new skyscrapers, et cetera, that it feels a little disorienting.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, I understand that through your family, you have deep Punahou connections. Isn't that right? Can you
Yes.
can you tell us what some of those are in terms of family?
Well, my grandmother on my dad's side actually taught at Punahou for a little while. This was many, many years ago, of course. During the war, she was called upon to, she had been a teacher, but when she had children originally, she was going to take care of them and not work. And then during the war, she was called upon to teach at Punahou, and she taught science and math classes at the middle grade, junior high level, and she went to Punahou herself. So it at least goes that far back. My dad went to Punahou, and my aunt, and both of them were swimmers. And oh my gosh, some of the faculty that we would remember. Mickey Bowers was my, an uncle, but, really a cousin. He was my dad's cousin. So I don't know what that makes him, cousin once removed, or anyway, he was Uncle Mickey. So he was there. And Laura Bowers, my great auntie, was, she worked for Punahou for a long time. And then my cousin, Lori Bowers Hussein, was also, and she, she worked at Punahou for quite a bit. So, yeah, and my brothers went. So for you, going to Punahou was very much a family affair. I mean, it was a part of, in some ways, your family's history, your family's legacy. Is that correct? So it must have felt very comfortable, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I mean, it didn't start out feeling as comfortable because we lived in Kailua, and by the time I went to kindergarten in Kainalo in Kailua, and by the time I hit first grade, I had established friends in Kailua, and none of them were going to Punahou. So I always kind of waited until I got home to play and feel a connection with friends. But eventually I made friends at Punahou. And then by the time we moved into town, we moved to Nu'uanu when I was in the 7th grade. And, my parents, metaphorically were dragging me kicking and screaming away from Kailua. But I ended up really loving living in Nu'uanu. And then, of course, once we hit high school and there were so many extra things we were all doing, I was glad that I lived that much closer.
Sure, absolutely. I just have a question. I have your newest book, How Not to Drown, and I found it really fascinating. One of the things that I found fascinating is at the very end of the book, you talk about some life events that inspired the book. And you talk about your own near drowning.
Oh, yes.
And I wonder if you can say something about that experience, what drowning even means to you. I think, living on an island near the ocean, in my mind, it's always somewhat of a fear, kind of a lurking fear. But tell me what that near drowning meant for you. What was it like?
Well, one thing that came out of it was a lecture from my dad, which he was entirely correct. I had always felt so comfortable in the waters around Hawaii that I didn't think twice going out and swimming alone. And what happened was I was with my brothers and, nephews and nieces and whatnot, but they were all going to walk out on the reef to Goat Island. And I was having trouble with my feet and, knew that would be very difficult for me to, even in reef shoes, walk along the reef to get out there. So I said I would swim out, and nobody thought anything of it because, coming from Hawaii, I was a good swimmer, and
sure,
I never thought anything of it. And I was out there. I had my snorkel and mask and enjoying, all the reef fish and whatnot. And at one point I realized that the tide was coming in very fast. And by the time I figured I better start swimming in, I was being caught in the current and being pulled out. And it was really, really frightening.
Oh my goodness.
It was frightening enough to generate a book that many years later.
Well, it's interesting to turn trauma into art, and
Yes.
that's great. That's wonderful. But and how old were you at the time, Jaimee?
Oh my gosh!
About.
Let me think. My mom died in 2012, and I came back out in 2013 because the whole family was going to get together, on the North Shore, and it would have been the first time without my mom. So. I don't know. How old were we in 2013?
Don't ask me to do math.
60. I know, me too. I don't know, 60s. I was, either, I think probably, was I 60? Early 60s, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I just wanted to establish, so you were already a mature adult. This is not when you're like 15 or anything.
I was a mature adult, and my dad was very right to give me a lecture about not swimming alone. If you don't know better at 60, you're never going to know better.
Right.
So and I had to learn the hard way.
But I would have just imagined, so you're coming from kind of an ocean-going family, and you trust that family knowledge in some ways, and your own bodily knowledge of the ocean, of water, etc. So that must have been a real surprise and shock for it to kind of turn on you, if you know what I mean.
No, it was a tremendous shock, and I won't lie, I really did get some trauma from it.
Sure.
For a couple years afterwards. In fact, the next time I went back to Hawaii, nobody in my family wanted to let me even go to the beach alone.
I understand. Sure.
I felt the same kind of fear. I remember going to in Wailikahala, I forget what beach it was called, but it was a beach that was very shallow if the tide was out. You could walk out for miles, and me being a tall person, it wasn't even coming up to my waist. And my sister-in-law still insisted on being with me. But I also, felt quite a bit of fear that if I dropped down in the water, somehow I wouldn't be able to get my face back up again, which was silly. It was very shallow, but and something like that happens, and it does kind of create a lasting trauma.
Sure.
But you're right. I worked a lot of it out in the book.
Oh, okay. So if you don't mind, tell us, how do you not drown? What is the answer to how not to drown?
The answer to how not to drown is to use your head. I mean, it just never occurred to me because we were so comfortable in the water that I had maybe, reached my physical limits, that I was an older woman and that I didn't have the strength that I used to have swimming. So how not to drown, use your head. Be careful.
Okay. And, in some ways, though, this notion of learning limits, or maybe learning new limits, is perhaps something that a lot of us have to face as we get older. We don't have the same bodies as we did even 10 years ago, much less 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And understanding those limits that can be, it can be jarring to all of a sudden be waylaid for whatever physical reason that might, 20 years ago, you might have just, it might have been not difficult to do.
Yeah.
And so, I think, relearning who you are vis-a-vis the rest of the world, I think is part of our ongoing lesson of how to be this age now, right?
I think you're absolutely right. And I have found, as I'm sure you have found too, each decade brings different challenges. I'm finding in our 70s, many more physical limitations than even in my 60s, when that drowning happened.
Right.
Yeah, we learn with our bodies, I guess, besides and our
Sure.
heads, our
Yeah.
minds.
And I'd like to think that there are also benefits of
Hmm.
getting older, that it's not all a downhill slide.
Yeah.
For you, what have some of the benefits been?
Well, I think as the saying goes, you get wiser. And I think that's true. It's not quite the wisdom I had expected. I thought I would suddenly become brilliant, the older I got. It's not that. I think we get a little wiser to the world. I think that, we still have our same kind of concerns, but maybe we're not, somehow so self-conscious about failing, for instance, because we've survived failures.
I mean, in some
So,
ways, that's very wise to think. How do you learn to survive failure, right?
yeah, you learn to survive failure, and I think that you feel a little more accepting of others that are struggling. Particularly younger people that are struggling with some of the same issues that we struggled with, and I don't know, maybe a little bit more at peace.
I mean, that's that golden grail of peace
Right,
that many of
exactly.
us are continually striving for,
Yeah.
and that's wonderful. You're still teaching.
I am still teaching, although, admittedly, I'm starting to fantasize more and more and more about retirement. I guess, there's sort of the fear of, it seems like a decision that can't be reversed. Once I tell the administration at my university that I'm going to be done, I can't decide the next year, well, no, I changed my mind, I'm coming back, because, they fill your slot with other faculty, as they should, younger
Right.
faculty. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it feels like a sort of permanent thing, but maybe I'm starting to feel, well, I'll be able to fill my time with other things. I'm
Oh,
not going to sit around and watch soap operas.
or maybe. I mean, soap operas not a bad idea, but okay.
Yeah.
But I'm just a little bit curious about your teaching, and I'm assuming that part of what you teach is creative writing. And I was just wondering, how do you teach or foster creativity?
Well, that's an interesting question. When I get my undergrads in particular, when I'm teaching grads, they already have a sense of how to do that for themselves. But with undergrads, it's a lot of getting them to just kind of open up and see the world, and not to be afraid to use their imaginations. I think in this era where so many, well, not just younger people. I mean, let's face it, many of us are streaming really very cool programs on television. Their imaginations are sparked. And I would have, at one time it was books that did that, and I still really encourage the reading of books if they actually want their imaginations to be sparked and become writers. But I get them to look around. I give them writing prompts that, kind of open up different scenarios or situations that they could put a character into and write to. And then we just, we read short stories and whatnot that are very creative and talk about how those stories are done.
It seems to me that the kind of atmosphere that has to be generated by you and the rest of the class is one of trust.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it might be difficult for somebody to open up, truly.
Yeah.
I was wondering, could you give us a sample of one of your prompts, your writing prompts that works particularly well for students?
Okay, well, let's see. Sometimes I will do something whereby I will talk about a story that we read and a situation that the character got into. And if it was the point of view of that character, I say, okay, now you take your character or one that you invent and place them in the situation and have this or that happen to them. So they've got kind of a little bit of a ladder as to where they're going, instead of just, saying, all right, for the next 10 minutes, you guys should write something,
Right.
Then they'll stare at me with dismay in their eyes. But if I give them kind of a step ladder to where a story could go, particularly if I talk about a story that we read and how that situation worked out for a character, and then say, but what if it didn't? Let's have you bring a character in a similar situation where they're in a diner or what have you, and instead of confronting the server accidentally spills coffee on them. What is the character going to do? So you just kind of give them these different guideposts, and then they run with it.
Well, that's great. It sounds like you create kind of a scaffolding of trust, and also enough structure so that they are willing to dip their toe in, maybe 2 toes, maybe 3 toes, maybe a whole foot, etc. And that's great. I was wondering if you could think back and consider is there one important teacher or incident or place that has taught you the most?
Well, at Punahou, it was, I think her last name was Takamuni, Diane, maybe Takamuni, who became Diane Anderson.
Right.
She taught creative writing I think I had her in junior and senior years. She was a tremendous influence on me. She actually, she gave me a spark. I felt that I wanted to write, and I wanted to write stories. Really, I was doing more poems at that time, but they weren't very good. But she didn't say that. She didn't say your poems aren't very good. When I told her that I wanted to write stories, and would give her a paragraph or whatnot, she would say, okay, well, this is a great paragraph. Now what happens next? Which is always the question in a story, to get a student to move forward. Wonderful. Well, what happens next? And then, the student writes what happens next. So she saw something in me that I hadn't really had acknowledged by any other teacher. I mean, I loved all my English classes in the academy, from Miss Lemon, freshman year, to, what was it, Mr. Mercer, who taught Shakespeare. I loved it. I just loved it. But this Diane Takamuni, she made me feel like I could do something.
And that's a wonderful gift. The gift of making you feel like you could do something.
Exactly.
Specifically you. And
it was huge. And then, when I went to college, I was fortunate enough to have another creative writing professor, Nelson Bentley, at the University of Washington, that, he was just encouraging to everyone. He was just the kindest person. And, he also made me feel like I could do this thing. So and that's when I started to kind of aim myself toward a career. Right.
And you talk about spark. And I think the spark is a thing that seems to define what you do, what you've done in the past, and the direction that you've taken. So, with that, I just want to say that we look forward to seeing you, Jaimee, in June. Thank you so much for providing our spark today with just a little bit of insight as to, what it might be to be a writer, a creative writer, and how you might inspire others to that kind of self-expression. Thank you so much, Jaimee.
Thank you, Chris, very much for having me.
Mahalo for listening. This has been Ku Punahou, a talk story podcast by, for, and about us, the Punahou class of 69. I'm your host, Cristiano, with production help from Carlene Tani and Sue Au Doyle. I hope that listening to these interviews might prompt each of us to reflect on those pivotal experiences and insights that make up our own lives, and to share them with families and friends. This is our responsibility, our ongoing legacy. So until next time, ahui ho.